Julian is playing white, and Julian plays their pawn to e4. And you'll notice that this is a typical opening that actually I recommend to my beginning students, and actually lots of coaches do the same. So bring the knight out to attack that pawn. Black brings their knight out to protect the pawn. And now white brings their bishop out in order to just to activate the piece. And now black brings another knight out. So bringing this bishop out, of course, gets it into one of the most active diagonals, and it also allows for the possibility of castling. But of course, white shouldn't castle yet perhaps because that pawn is being attacked. So what do they do about that? They bring this pawn up, which is actually a very good move. Protects that pawn, and prepares the castle in the next move. Okay, so now it's black to move, and black does something similar. They protect that pawn. They move this pawn out to protect this pawn, and it allows the bishop to get out. The problem with that move, though, is that it blocks in the bishop. You know, it'd be better to move this bishop out first. Well, or even here, play check, right? Or even here. By blocking the bishop in, it means that it might take a little bit longer for them to get that bishop into an active position. Now, in this position, I wouldn't have played this move, but this is what white did, brought the bishop out. It's not really clear that that's where the bishop belongs. A better move for white might have been to castle. And another possible move is to play here to bring their knight out. And a third possibility, which is very common in this opening, which is to play here with the idea of getting ready to move that d-pawn from d3 to d4 to try to gain more control of the center. So this move already helps gain control of this d4 square, but the next move they'll move that pawn too. So all of those I think were better moves. Getting that piece out was just a little bit suspect, maybe a little bit too passive in a sense. Although it does get the piece into an active position, it may not be the best place for it. In fact, another possibility would have been to bring it to a more active post here. That's definitely an active thing because it's pinning the knight. All right, so that's the theory. All right, so in this position, it's now black to move, and black plays pawn to d5. Now, in some ways, that's a peculiar move. Look at that pawn. What's it doing? Well, also, what did it just do? Only a few moves ago, in the previous move, it moved one square, and now it moved a second square. So, remember, one of our guidelines was don't move the same piece twice, and that also applies to the pawns. So, in a sense, black wasted a little bit of time. On the other hand, the move does have a threat because they could move one square further. Well, first of all, they're attacking the bishop. But if the bishop just moved, for example, if white played here, they could move even one square further, and then they're attacking the bishop and gaining more space. So the move, even though it violates a principle, it actually turns out that it might even be the best move in that position. Okay, so now it's white to move, and white does play the best possible move in this position, which is to take the pawn off. And black correctly takes the pawn as well. So we have an even exchange of pawns. But what's happened is, let's take a look at before and after. Just before that exchange, black's knight was here. Black's knight was over here before taking the pawn. And now it goes to a more active position. So by exchanging pawns, white has brought about a case where black's knight is more active now than it was before, and in fact it's even attacking this bishop. Okay, so this is a fairly decent position for black already, because black has a pawn occupying a central square while white doesn't. White's only pawn in the center is at d3 while black's is on d5. So remember these four squares, d4, e4, d5 and e5 are the most important central squares, and black is actually occupying both of those and controlling both. So what does white do? Well, white brings a knight out, and so that move has merit because white is trying to help gain control back of the center. And in this position, well, black has several possibilities. Black could have just taken that knight off, and after this, he's slightly damaged white's pawn structure. It's not a serious damage. We'll talk about pawn structure when we talk about strategy more, because now this pawn is controlling an important central square. So in a way, that's not the best move for black, but it's not the worst either. I think a better possibility for black would have been to take the bishop, because then after white takes back, black has an advantage known as the advantage of the two bishops. Both of these bishops are ready to spring into action. And as I said before, two bishops can be very powerful and give the person with the two bishops an advantage over the other person who only has a bishop and a knight. They're missing one of their bishops. So if I was playing black, that's the move I would have played, was knight takes the bishop on e3. That's what I would have done. But instead, black brings another piece out, and there's nothing really wrong with that move, because it helps protect the knight, so that if white wants to exchange pieces, black is not worried about losing anything. Okay, maybe I should have mentioned this. In this position, white actually has a threat, because white has two pieces attacking this knight here. The knight, white's knight on c3 and white's bishop on c4 are both attacking the knight on d5. So there's two pieces attacking that knight, only one defending. So something needed to be done about that knight. It was being threatened. And so remember all the 6 possible things that can happen? Move the piece, run, exchange, do something else. In this case, black chose to defend that. So far, both players aren't playing necessarily the best possible moves. They're not necessarily playing grandmaster moves, but they're following the guidelines, and they're playing reasonably good moves here. So now it's white's turn. And let's see what white does first. White starts doing exchanges. We just talked about that in the abstract. And now if I was playing white here, and I've already decided I'm not worried about this bishop, I would have just castled, because that's another developing move. It's getting closer to getting out of the opening. So let's say that happened, right? And neither side exchanged. Black could do this too. And then white could play a move like this. Okay? And the purpose of that move would be to do something that I just talked about in this lesson, is that connects the two rooks. And we'll see why that's important over and over again in many of our sample games. And then in this position, this is not what happened in the game, but black could do that, and say, after, say, white moves a rook here, which is on what's called an open file, putting pressure on that pawn, black might decide to do this. Okay? I'm not saying these are the best moves, but now you see that black has their rooks connected. So this is just one other possibility of what can happen. Chess has almost what you might call infinite possibilities. It's not really infinite, but it's so many, it almost might as well be. So this is what happened in the game. Black played their bishop to e6, and white decided to exchange. And once the knight takes, the bishop has to take. You wouldn't want to take with the queen. That would be terrible. You'd lose your queen, right? So, of course, after white takes the knight, black takes with the bishop. And so what's happened? Both of the knights have disappeared from the board, and the bishop that was on e6 is now on d5. So what we've done what white has done by exchanging has actually improved black's position. And then black continues initiating another exchange, and you see what happens. The result of all these exchanges, let's go back and see what was going on before, just so you could see, compare, is that while this knight and this bishop were fairly active, while, for example, black's bishop on e6 was not that active, and the queen was back on its original square, both queens are, after the exchanges, the result is that black's queen is now in a much more active position. Black's bishop and knight, of course, have disappeared in the exchanges, and so is white's bishop and knight. But in this position, black actually does have a superior position from a strategic point of view. Black has the extra e5 pawn, controlling important central squares, d4 in particular, but also f4. The knight also controls that square, d4, and so does the queen. So that's one of the advantages. And black only just has one more piece to move to get all the pieces developed, and then castle. Now it's true, white is ahead by a tempo and could castle right away, but the superior central position is what makes black's position just slightly better from a strategic point of view. So let's see what happens here. White castles. Well, I think it's time for you to tell me what you think black's best move is here. So take a few moments, think about all the opening guidelines you've learned so far, and see if you could come up with one or two possible good moves for black in this position. I suggest you pause the video, think about this. Of course, I'm assuming you're playing this position out on your own board with your own pieces, because that will help you to really grasp what's going on here and follow the game better by using your own pieces and your own board and actually moving them, physically moving them. Those pieces yourself will help you grasp these concepts better and help you remember them. Okay, so do you have an idea what would be a good move for black in this position? Well, if you said bishop to e7, preparing the castle, that is definitely a good idea. If you said bishop over here instead, that's not a bad move either. It may end up having pieces exchange, but there would be no big disadvantage or advantage for either side. And another possibility might even be to go here. For one thing, you're preventing the rook from going to e1, and if white tried to chase you away, well, you could still go here, and the effect is that now, by that pawn that was moved from c2 to c3, that pawn is no longer protecting the d3 pawn, so now that's a weakness. So remember earlier today, I talked about the idea of creating a weakness. So this bishop was on f8, and if it moved to b4 and kind of provoked this attack, then it can run away, and you've provoked a weakness. And here's the interesting thing is, remember I said that this pawn, this knight, this queen, and now this bishop all control this square. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces, while white is also has 3 pieces. 1, the bishop, the knight, and this pawn control the square. And if he actually moved this pawn, that would be 4 pieces. So we could have an exchange here. And in this position, this is when we're talking about exchanges, if you count, black has the knight, the bishop, and the queen attacking this pawn. But white has 3 pieces protecting it. So black really shouldn't take it because they would lose a piece. So let me just show you what I mean by that. This is part of the instruction of this game. What just happened? Looking at this, of course, black could take the queen, but the end result of black taking the pawn on the d4 square is that white is ahead by a bishop. So black wouldn't do that, right? That would be a very bad exchange. So this pawn move would be okay, except black doesn't have to exchange. They could just go here. And now this is a pawn, which is, now we're getting into strategy. This pawn is what's called isolated because there's no pawns available to ever protect it. And that pawn is now a possible weakness. All right? So for example, let's say white played here. Black could castle. And all of a sudden, black has a real threat on this pawn. There's a bishop, a knight, and a rook and a queen all attacking at 4 pieces, and it's only protected by 3. Okay, so this is another possibility. These are all the kinds of possibilities you could be thinking about. And although it may seem a little overwhelming when we're talking about them right now, after you follow some games, you will see that these things become second nature. All right, well, now we're back into the actual game, and we're going to move along here. Because in this position, it's black to move. And as we said before, a correct move, now it's black to move. Correct move would have been, for example, to play bishop to e7 just to get ready to castle. That's probably the safest of all the moves for black. And so that's what black should do, something like that. Okay? But instead, in this position, black played an aggressive move. Okay, so the problem with this is, there's about 3 different problems with this move. One is, that pawn was doing a great job where it was. It didn't need to move. Another thing is, the pawn already moved once. You should get all your pieces active before you start initiating action. So moving that pawn was bad from that point of view. And also from the point of view of tactics in general, making this move allows white to gain a better position and what we would call gain time and start making threats. Another word for saying that is seize the initiative. So white correctly exchanged that pawn off. And now the queen is not in a great position. The black queen. Let's see why. In this position, white played the bishop to d4. Now, if I was playing this, I might have just played rook to e1. And the reason for that is that kind of setting a trap, for example, if black played kind of a neutral or wasted move, then white could do this. Take that pawn. Because they're threatening to take the queen, so black doesn't have time to take that bishop back. So this is what's an example of several tactics in one. By the bishop moving away, we now have a discovered attack on the queen. But the other thing is, the queen can't move away. Why not? Oh, because the queen is pinned. So I would have played that rook move because it puts black under pressure to do something. Probably black's, one of black's replies would be to play here, but then this bishop could go here. The queen is attacked, and the queen can move, but say he goes there, but now we could put black in a weaker position by taking that off. And notice the knight is pinned, and this is just a better position for white here. Attack that queen, which is defending the knight, and the king is stuck in the center of the board while white's is castled. So white would definitely have a what's called a positional or a strategic advantage here. Okay, well, this is not exactly what happened. Instead, as I showed you, white, it's white to move. White just played the bishop to d4. So before we move on, you should be able to say, what is the threat that white has here? Take a good look at this position.